Imagine a quiet village, its charming streets concealing a web of forgotten secrets. Now add a missing child, an abandoned cottage at the edge of town, and whispers of a past too dark to remember. In the mystery of Ashwood Lane, every clue leads deeper into a mystery, and what's uncovered could be more dangerous than anyone imagined. Settle in. This tale of family secrets and long-buried lies will keep you guessing until the very last word. Lucy Hargrove had not visited Rosewood Vale in over 5 years. The village, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and fringed with ancient oak trees, seemed to have hardly changed at all. The cottages, with their ivy-clad walls and thatched roofs, still stood as they had in her childhood, evoking memories of summers spent running along its cobbled streets. Yet, as the train slowed and Lucy peered out at the familiar landscape, she felt a strange unease settle over her, as if the village was hiding something beneath its picturesque charm. It had been her grandmother, Edith, who had persuaded her to come. A letter had arrived a week earlier, an urgent invitation to visit. Edith, sharp-witted and respected, was a figure of authority in Rosewood Vale. Everyone seemed to trust her to untangle the webs of gossip and unearth the hidden truths buried beneath the polite facades of the villagers. It was one of the reasons Lucy had always admired her, though it also made Edith's silence on certain matters all the more intriguing. Lucy stepped off the train, taking in the crisp air of late autumn. The scent of damp leaves mingled with the faint aroma of fresh bread from the bakery. She quickly adjusted her scarf against the chill and set off down the narrow road leading to Edith's home. The village, while lovely, felt strangely quiet. It had been 3 days since young Tommy Cartwright had gone missing, and Lucy could sense the weight of the village's collective worry. People moved with purpose but avoided eye contact, their conversations hushed. Even the once bustling marketplace seemed quieter than usual, as if the villagers themselves were unsure how to react. Some of them had spoken about Tommy's disappearance in hushed tones, but few had said much to Lucy. The police had been called, but there had been no progress, and whispers filled the air that the authorities were not looking in the right places. Lucy's feet crunched on the gravel path as she made her way up to Edith's front door. The house was just as it had been when she left, neatly kept with flower boxes lining the windowsills and a bright yellow door that contrasted against the gray stone. Inside, Edith greeted her with a warm smile, her sharp eyes taking in Lucy's every movement as she stepped through the door. At 72, Edith still had the fire of someone half her age, and her keen mind was as alert as ever. She ushered Lucy inside and led her into the cozy sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. As they settled into the room, Edith's expression shifted, her smile fading slightly as she spoke of the recent events. "I'm glad you've come, Lucy. It's good to have someone here." Her voice was steady, though her eyes betrayed a trace of concern. "Grandmother, what's going on here?" Lucy asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I can feel the tension in the air. The villagers are on edge." Edith's gaze darkened as she leaned forward, folding her hands in her lap. "It's Tommy Cartwright. The boy's gone missing." She paused, watching Lucy closely. "He was last seen near Ashwood Lane." Lucy frowned. "Ashwood Lane? That old road at the edge of the village?" She had heard of it in passing, but the lane had always been more of a legend than a place, shrouded in superstition and avoided by most of the villagers. "Yes," Edith replied, her tone measured. "A strange place, that lane. Full of stories. Full of secrets, too, if you ask the right people." Lucy felt a shiver of intrigue stir within her. "And what's happened? The police have no answers." "No," Edith said, her voice dropping slightly. "The police have made no progress. They've searched the area, but there's no sign of him. Some of the villagers believe the boy's disappearance is tied to something that's happened there before, but no one's talking." Just as Edith finished speaking, there was a soft knock on the door. Edith's expression shifted to one of quiet resignation. "That's Mrs. Cartwright, Tommy's mother," she said, standing to greet the woman. The door opened and a thin, haggard woman stepped into the room. Mrs. Cartwright's face was drawn with worry, her eyes red-rimmed from days of sleepless nights. She was a woman out of options, someone whose desperation was palpable. She came straight to Edith, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need your help," she said, her voice hoarse. The police. They're not looking in the right places. They're wasting their time. They don't understand this place, don't understand what's really happening. I need you to find Tommy. Edith regarded the woman quietly before nodding. I'll see what I can do, she said simply. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that Lucy recognized. As Mrs. Cartwright sank into a chair by the fire, the conversation turned back to Ashwood Lane. Edith spoke of the strange occurrences in the past, disappearances and odd happenings that the village had chosen to forget. But there was no forgetting them now, not with Tommy's disappearance casting a long shadow over Rosewood Vale. Maybe I can help, Lucy said, her voice steady with a mixture of resolve and curiosity. If you think it's something connected to the lane, I'll go with you, grandmother. I won't stand by while a child is lost. Edith looked at her granddaughter with a knowing expression. Very well, Lucy, but be careful. There are secrets buried in this village, and not all of them want to be found. The early morning mist had not yet cleared as Lucy and Edith set out for Ashwood Lane. The village still lay shrouded in a damp quiet, the chill of the air heavy with the promise of rain. Lucy adjusted the collar of her coat as they walked, her eyes scanning the streets of Rosewood Vale that grew sparser the farther they went. The houses here were fewer, the road less traveled, and a palpable tension seemed to hang in the air. Ashwood Lane was not part of any ordinary route. Its entrance was tucked away on the outskirts of the village, a narrow path where the cobblestone gradually faded into dirt and then into thick, unkempt grass. As they passed the last house on the edge of the village, the familiar sounds of daily life, laughter, the clink of cups, children playing, fell away, leaving only the sound of their footsteps, muffled and solitary. It's as if the village itself is afraid to remember what happened here, Lucy remarked, glancing at Edith, who walked ahead with her usual purpose, eyes sharp. It's not fear, Lucy, Edith replied, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. It's avoidance, a reluctance to face what's been buried, and there's always something buried here. The path grew more difficult to navigate as they ventured deeper, the underbrush clawing at their legs, the trees bending and arching overhead like silent sentinels, shutting out the weak morning light. It was an eerie silence that greeted them, one that did not feel natural. It was as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to disturb it. At the end of the lane, the overgrowth opened up to reveal the abandoned cottage. It stood at the very edge of the woods, its silhouette gaunt and haunting against the dim sky. The roof had sagged in places, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges sharp against the decay of the building. The door hung slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry, but had never returned to close it behind them. Edith paused, her eyes studying the cottage with an intensity that Lucy could not quite place. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself before stepping forward. "Stay alert, Lucy. There's more here than meets the eye," Edith murmured, her voice soft but commanding. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of mold and forgotten time. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they crossed the threshold. The room they entered was dim, lit only by the weak light filtering through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and old furniture was strewn about, its upholstery faded and torn. It was near the hearth that they found the first clue. A small, scuffed shoe, far too small to belong to an adult, lay on the cold stone floor by the fireplace. Lucy crouched beside it, her breath catching as she reached out. The leather was worn but still recognizable, and the pattern of stitching along the side was one she had seen before. It was unmistakably Tommy's. "Tommy's shoe," Lucy whispered more to herself than to Edith. Her heart beat faster. "He was here." Edith did not say anything, but Lucy could see the flicker of understanding in her grandmother's eyes. Edith's gaze shifted to the nearby shelf, where a collection of faded photographs sat haphazardly stacked in a wooden frame. Some were so old that the edges had curled and the faces had become mere shadows, but others were startlingly clear. A young man in a military uniform, a woman holding a baby with a wistful smile, and a group of people standing outside the very cottage they now occupied. "This house has seen many lives, many stories," Edith remarked quietly. "But these faces are not familiar." Lucy nodded, her mind racing. "Are they connected to the Cartwrights?" "I don't know. Edith replied, lifting one of the photographs from the pile. "But something tells me we're looking at more than just a missing boy here. This place has witnessed more than its fair share of disappearances." They stood there in silence for a long moment, as if the cottage itself was reluctant to share any further secrets. Finally, Edith spoke again, her voice low and serious. "We need to leave before someone else notices we've been here. But we'll come back. There's more to this than we know." As they turned to leave, they found themselves face to face with Mr. Dunley, the village gamekeeper. His appearance was unexpected and unsettling, tall, with a gaunt face and dark eyes that never seemed to blink. His usual gruff demeanor was more intense today, as if he had sensed their presence long before they had seen him. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Ashwood Lane isn't a place for strangers or for the curious." Lucy straightened, meeting his gaze. "We're not strangers," she replied coolly, her curiosity piqued by the man's tone. "And we're certainly not afraid." Mr. Dunley's lips twisted into something resembling a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "You should be. The lane has its own way of dealing with those who meddle. Some things are better left alone, miss." With a final glance at them, he turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving Lucy with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She looked to Edith, but her grandmother said nothing, the same thoughtful expression lingering on her face. Before they could speak further, they were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. From the shadows, Agnes Millfield, the village herbalist, appeared. She was a reclusive figure, always seen in long skirts and heavy shawls, her face pale and sharp. She lived alone in a small cottage not far from here, and though she was known to provide remedies to the villagers, she kept to herself, speaking little about her life. "Out for another stroll, are we?" Agnes asked, her voice laced with an unmistakable edge. Her eyes flicked to the cottage, then to the shoe in Lucy's hand, before returning to Edith with a knowing look. "We're just looking around," Edith replied smoothly. "But I don't suppose you know much about Ashwood Lane, do you, Agnes?" Agnes hesitated, her gaze darting nervously before she spoke again, her words carefully measured. "I know enough to stay away. People here have long memories. There's no good that comes from poking around in things better left forgotten." Lucy felt her pulse quicken. "But you don't mind when others do it?" she asked, not bothering to conceal her skepticism. Agnes's smile was thin, brittle. "I mind my own business, miss, and you would do well to mind yours." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the two women standing in the road, the mystery of Ashwood Lane growing heavier with every passing moment. As they made their way back to Edith's house, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees like a soft warning. Edith was quiet, her mind no doubt turning over the strange encounters and the unsettling discovery they had made. "We're closer to something, Lucy," she finally said. "But there's much more to uncover before we'll understand it all." And Lucy could only agree. Something larger than Tommy's disappearance was at play, and the secrets of Ashwood Lane were slowly revealing themselves, one step at a time. The village of Rosewood Vale was not large, and its inhabitants had lived here for generations. As the days passed, Lucy and Edith began to question the villagers in earnest, seeking any information that might link Tommy Cartwright's disappearance to the strange events surrounding Ashwood Lane. But as they made their rounds, Lucy felt increasingly that the village itself was conspiring to withhold its secrets. They began with the vicar, Reverend Palmer, who was known for his cryptic sermons and aloof demeanor. His church was an imposing structure at the center of the village, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The interior, however, was quiet and serene, with tall, narrow windows casting soft beams of light across the pews. The vicar was seated at his desk in the back of the church, surrounded by piles of old books and papers, his fingers moving slowly over a well-worn Bible. "Ah, Edith, Lucy," the vicar greeted them with a faint nod, his eyes hidden behind the shadow of his brow. "I hear you're looking for answers." "We are," Edith replied, her tone polite but firm. "We need to understand what happened to young Tommy Cartwright. We believe his disappearance is tied to Ashwood Lane, and we've heard whispers of past events that might shed light on the mystery." The vicar's lips pressed together in a thin line, and he paused for a long moment before speaking. "Ashwood Lane, you say?" His voice was low, tinged with something that could have been caution or perhaps regret. There are sins in this village, sins of the past that should not be dredged up. There are things that cannot be undone, things that should remain buried. Lucy exchanged a quick glance with Edith, sensing the tension in the room. "What do you mean, Reverend?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "What happened?" The vicar raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "I cannot speak of it. Some things are better left undisturbed, for the peace of the village and its people. You must not go digging into matters that were buried long ago." "Is this about Ashwood Lane?" Edith asked, her voice softer now, more understanding but equally insistent. Reverend Palmer's eyes darted toward the door as though fearing someone might overhear. He looked back at them, his face filled with a deep sadness. "You don't know what you're asking," he murmured. "There are ghosts on that lane, not of the spirit but of the past. Let them stay in the past." With that, he fell silent, turning back to his desk and dismissing them without another word. It was clear that the vicar knew more than he was letting on, but he was unwilling, or perhaps too frightened, to speak. Next, they visited Mrs. Green, the local historian. She lived in a small, cluttered cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by piles of books and old maps. The smell of dust and aged paper filled the air as Lucy and Edith stepped inside. Mrs. Green was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s with spectacles perched precariously on the tip of her nose. She welcomed them warmly but eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What can I do for you, my dears?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "We're looking into the history of Ashwood Lane," Edith began. "We believe Tommy Cartwright's disappearance might be connected to events from the past, and we were hoping you could tell us more about the area's history." Mrs. Green's expression darkened and she hesitated before speaking. Ashwood Lane." She paused as though searching her memory. "It's always been a place of misfortune, you know. Years ago, there was a terrible accident on that lane, a tragedy that scarred the village. A family, once well regarded in Rosewood Vale, died there, all of them in a fire. It was a horrible thing." Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her thoughts. "The details are unclear," Mrs. Green continued, her eyes distant as though recalling the events from a long-forgotten dream. "But it was said that the fire was no accident. There were whispers of foul play, though nothing was ever proven. After that, strange things began to happen. People began to disappear, one after another, and some said it was the curse of Ashwood Lane. The villagers, of course, never talked about it openly. They chose to forget." "Do you think Tommy's disappearance could be connected to this?" Edith asked, her voice low but filled with quiet urgency. Mrs. Green nodded slowly. "I wouldn't be surprised. Sometimes when the past is buried too deep, it has a way of coming back to haunt us." The story left Lucy feeling unsettled, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Why had this tragedy been forgotten? And how did it tie into Tommy's disappearance? Their final stop was at the Cartwright family home. Edward Cartwright, Tommy's father, was a tall, heavy-set man with a somber expression. He greeted them with a stiff nod at the door, but offered no warm welcome. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face seemed drawn, as if the weight of his son's disappearance had taken a toll on him. "We're here to ask you about Tommy," Edith said, her tone gentle but direct. "We're concerned, Edward. We believe his disappearance might be connected to something in the village's past." Edward's face seemed to tighten at the mention of the past, but he said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant and flat. "I don't know what you want from me. The police are handling it. My son is gone, and that's all there is to it." "But you must know something," Lucy pressed. "You're his father. You've known him his whole life. Does this have anything to do with Ashwood Lane?" Edward's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He sighed deeply, looking away as though the very question exhausted him. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what to think anymore. I'm just trying to keep it together for my wife, for the village. But I don't have the answers." Lucy felt the growing sense that Edward was hiding something, though whether it was out of fear or indifference was hard to tell. His detachment seemed more than just grief. It seemed like something deeper, something he wasn't willing to confront. As they left the Cartwrights' house, the air between them was thick with unanswered questions. Lucy sensed that many of the villagers were withholding information, either out of fear or complicity. The truth, it seemed, was buried under layers of silence and reluctance. Edith turned to Lucy as they walked away. "We're getting closer," she said quietly. "But the village is full of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, and someone doesn't want us to uncover them." The morning after their conversation with Mrs. Green, Lucy found herself sitting at the kitchen table in Edith's cottage, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph she had found in the abandoned cottage. The faded image seemed to pulse with significance, though she couldn't yet understand why. It depicted a man, young and dashing in his military uniform, his face smiling in an old-fashioned way that felt oddly familiar. She stared at the photograph for a long while, feeling as if there was something just beyond her reach, something important that she couldn't yet grasp. Edith entered the room, her eyes flicking immediately to the photograph in Lucy's hands. She raised an eyebrow, her expression thoughtful. "You've found something, haven't you?" Edith asked, her voice steady but curious. "I think so," Lucy replied, sliding the photo across the table. "This man, he looks familiar. I can't place him, but I feel like I've seen him before. He was in that cottage with those other photographs." Edith studied the image closely. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment she looked as though she were lost in thought. Then a flicker of recognition passed across her face. "Tommy's great-uncle," Edith said quietly, her voice low. "I thought I had seen him in the Cartwrights' home. This is Edward's brother, Paul Cartwright. He disappeared when he was a young man, vanished without a trace, just like Tommy." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, vanished without a trace?" Edith took a deep breath, settling herself into a chair. "It was years ago, long before Tommy was born. Paul Cartwright was a young man, full of promise, until he disappeared one winter evening. No one ever knew what happened to him. Some said he had gone off to join the military, others thought he'd run away from the village. But the truth is, no one really knew, and no one talked about it. It was a painful subject for the Cartwrights, and the village turned a blind eye." "Is it possible," Lucy began slowly, "that Tommy's disappearance is somehow connected to Paul's?" Edith's eyes met hers, sharp and knowing. "I think it's more than possible, Lucy. I think Tommy's disappearance is part of a larger, generational mystery involving the Cartwright family, and I have a feeling that Ashwood Lane is at the heart of it." Lucy felt the weight of the discovery settle on her shoulders. She picked up the photograph once again, studying the young man's face. Paul Cartwright's smile seemed to mock her, as if the secrets of his disappearance were locked behind those youthful eyes, waiting to be unlocked. She was sure now that the photograph wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a key to understanding what had happened to Tommy. The air between them was thick with unanswered questions, but Lucy knew one thing for sure. The Cartwrights' history was far from ordinary, and the mystery surrounding their family was much deeper than she had originally thought. Later that afternoon, Lucy and Edith decided to return to Ashwood Lane. They both felt a growing urgency, as if they were racing against time to uncover the truth before someone else intervened. The lane seemed even more oppressive today, the trees more tangled, the air heavier with the promise of rain. As they approached the abandoned cottage once again, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, her senses heightened, but saw nothing unusual. Edith walked ahead, her stride purposeful, but there was a noticeable tension in her posture, as if she too felt the presence of something lurking just beyond their sight. They entered the cottage carefully, the floorboards creaking underfoot as they stepped into the dim, musty space. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of age and decay, but Lucy was too focused on their mission to be distracted by it. She scanned the room, looking for anything else that might connect the dots between Paul Cartwright's disappearance and Tommy's. As she moved toward the fireplace, she noticed something odd near the base of the wall, a small gap between the wooden panels. The gap seemed too narrow to be a door, but something about it caught her attention. She knelt down, running her fingers along the edges of the gap, and felt a slight shift beneath her hand. "Edith," Lucy called softly, her voice low with excitement. "I think there's something here." Edith came over and crouched beside her, her eyes immediately narrowing at the discovery. She examined the gap with a critical eye before reaching out to gently press on the edge of the panel. To Lucy's surprise, the wood creaked and shifted slightly, revealing a hidden passageway. It was narrow and dark, its end obscured by shadows. "This place is full of secrets," Edith murmured, her voice tinged with both intrigue and caution. Before they could investigate further, they heard a faint noise, a rustling of leaves outside. The sound was subtle, but enough to send a shiver down Lucy's spine. She froze, her senses on alert. Someone was outside, watching them. "Do you hear that?" Lucy whispered, glancing toward the door. Edith nodded, her eyes narrowing. "We're not alone." Lucy stood slowly, her heart racing. The passageway was tantalizingly close to revealing its secrets, but they couldn't risk staying in the cottage any longer. They needed to leave, fast. Just as they began to turn, a shadow appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. A figure stood there, tall and imposing, silhouetted against the dimming light outside. The figure didn't speak, but the tension in the air was suffocating. It was as though they had crossed an invisible line. Edith's voice was calm but firm. "I think we've seen enough for today." The figure remained motionless, but as Lucy and Edith made their way to the door, they could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze on them. As they stepped outside, the figure vanished into the trees, leaving them in silence. "What was that?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," Edith replied, her expression tight with worry. "But we're getting dangerously close to something that someone doesn't want us to find." The following days felt like a race against time. The deeper Lucy and Edith ventured into the mystery of Tommy's disappearance, the more it became clear that someone in the village was actively trying to obstruct their investigation. The threads they had uncovered so far seemed to be tangled with lies, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to discern the truth from the deception. Their first confrontation came with Mr. Dunley, the gamekeeper, a man whose secretive nature had already aroused suspicion. They encountered him on the outskirts of the village while they were investigating a small clearing near the woods. His eyes narrowed when he saw them, and he immediately stepped forward, blocking their path. "I told you before," Mr. Dunley said, his voice tight with irritation. "Ashwood Lane is not a place for you. You're meddling with something that's none of your concern." Lucy stood her ground. "You seem to have a lot to say about Ashwood Lane, Mr. Dunley. Why are you so interested in keeping people away?" Dunley's face tightened and he glanced around, clearly uneasy. "You think you know something, but you don't. There's nothing there worth your time. The boy's gone, and that's all there is to it." "Then why?" Lucy pressed. "Were you seen near the lane the day Tommy went missing? The police reports suggest you were at the edge of the woods that evening." Dunley hesitated, and for a split second, his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. "I don't remember being there," he muttered, his voice turning defensive. "I've got nothing to do with it. You should be asking the Cartwrights. Ask them what they're hiding." But Lucy wasn't convinced. There was something off about his response, a lie buried in his words that he was trying to cover up with bluster. She exchanged a look with Edith, who nodded ever so slightly, her eyes sharp with suspicion. As they made their way back to the village, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every step they took seemed to echo with the knowledge that someone or something was keeping a close eye on their every move. Later that afternoon, their investigation took them to the small, cluttered church that stood near the village green. The church, like the rest of Rosewood Vale, seemed to carry an air of ancient, forgotten history. Its dark stone walls were overgrown with ivy, and the heavy oak doors creaked as they opened. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and dust, and the faintest echoes of hymns from years past seemed to linger in the air. They were met by Agnes Millfield, the herbalist who had always been a bit of a mystery herself. She was in the church archives, poring over a stack of old, yellowed records. Her eyes darted nervously as they entered, and she quickly tried to conceal what she was doing, but not fast enough. "Agnes," Edith began calmly, "what are you doing with these records?" Agnes stiffened, her face turning pale. She hesitated, then seemed to try and cover up her discomfort with a forced smile. "I'm just sorting through some old papers. Nothing that concerns you." Lucy stepped closer to the desk, and as she peered down, she saw that some of the records had been hastily torn, their edges ragged. The pages that remained were nearly blank, and there was a distinct sense of urgency in the way they had been handled. "These documents could have helped us understand the history of Ashwood Lane," Lucy said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Why are you destroying them?" Agnes recoiled as though slapped. "I'm not destroying anything," she snapped, her voice rising with defensive anger. "These are just old records. They're of no use. Nothing to worry about here." Lucy felt a surge of doubt. "But you've destroyed them," she countered. "Why?" Agnes faltered for a moment, her lips trembling, before she gave a final resigned sigh. I don't know what you want from me. I'm trying to protect the village, protect the truth from coming out. Some things are best forgotten." Her confession left Lucy with a heavy sense of unease. Agnes's words hinted at something darker lurking in the village's past, something that had been hidden away for far too long. But what was Agnes really trying to protect? And who else in the village was willing to go to such lengths to keep the past buried? As they left the church, Lucy's mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Their next stop was at the Cartwright house. This time, they weren't here for answers. They were here to confront Edward Cartwright. The man greeted them with an aloof, almost weary expression. His demeanor had become more withdrawn since Tommy's disappearance, and his earlier detachment now seemed to carry an air of fear. "Edward," Edith began gently, her voice low and measured. "We need to talk about Tommy. We've uncovered some things that might be related to your family's past. We need you to tell us the truth." Edward shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the window as though checking for prying eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his tone defensive. But this time Lucy could see the cracks in his facade. His hands were shaking slightly, his voice betraying his attempts to keep his composure. "Edward," Lucy said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We know you've been receiving threats. We know someone is trying to silence you. Who is it?" Edward's eyes widened, and he looked as though he might collapse under the weight of his own secret. Finally, he let out a slow breath and lowered his head in defeat. "I've been getting anonymous letters. They told me to keep quiet, to not let anyone dig into the past," he confessed, his voice shaking. "I don't know who's behind it, but I've been too afraid to speak out. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all go away, but now—" Lucy's heart pounded as the pieces began to fall into place. Someone in the village, someone powerful, was pulling the strings. They were determined to keep the past hidden, and they were willing to do whatever it took to silence anyone who came too close. "We're not stopping, Edward," Edith said firmly, her voice resolute. "We need the truth." Before Edward could respond, Lucy felt a sudden shift in the air. She turned to Edith, her voice low with urgency. "We need to go. I think we've been here too long." As they walked away from the Cartwright house, Edith spoke quietly, but there was an unmistakable edge to her words. "We're getting closer, Lucy. But I fear that the well near Ashwood Lane holds the answers we're searching for. And if that's the case, we may not be the only ones looking for it." The days had become a blur of questions and dead ends. But now, standing in the shadow of Ashwood Lane, Lucy and Edith both knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to pry open its long-forgotten secrets. And at last, they had found the key, the well. Lucy had heard the old local legend, murmured by Mrs. Green, about a hidden well near Ashwood Lane that had been used to conceal illicit activities long ago. Some said it was used for hiding stolen goods. Others whispered darker tales about what had been concealed within it. But the more Lucy and Edith had uncovered, the more it seemed that the well might hold the answers to Tommy's disappearance and perhaps the mystery of the Cartwright family. They approached the well late in the afternoon, when the light was beginning to wane and the trees cast long shadows over the ground. The area around the cottage had been abandoned for years, left to grow wild and untamed, but now Lucy could see it. Hidden beneath a thick tangle of brambles and ivy, the worn stone edge of the well just barely visible. "This is it," Edith said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of certainty and caution. Lucy bent down, brushing aside the heavy undergrowth, revealing the full outline of the well. It was ancient, the stone cracked and weathered, but it still stood firm, as though guarding something important. The sight of it sent a shiver down Lucy's spine, but there was no turning back now. Together, they pulled away the remaining foliage, clearing the space around the well, and Lucy peered down into the dark opening. The smell of damp earth and decay rose from below, but there was something else, something more foreboding, as if the well had held something in its depths for far too long. "I'm going down," Edith said, her voice resolute. "Stay here and keep watch." Before Lucy could protest, Edith had already lowered herself onto the rope that hung by the well's edge. Lucy's heart raced as she watched her grandmother disappear into the darkness. She had never known Edith to be afraid, but the sense of unease in the air seemed to heighten with every second that passed. Minutes later, Edith's voice came back up from the well, muffled but clear. "There's something here, Lucy, a satchel and other things." Lucy felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" "I'll bring it up," Edith replied. When Edith finally emerged from the well, she was holding an old, weathered satchel in one hand, its leather cracked and discolored by age. She set it carefully on the ground, and as she opened it, a rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of old paper and dust. Inside the satchel were several documents, their edges curled and yellowed with time. Lucy's eyes immediately fell on one, a piece of paper that seemed to have been hastily written. She could make out a few words, blackmail, secrets, and Cartwright, but it was something else that caught her eye, something far more personal. Beneath the documents lay a small, worn toy. Tommy's toy, the one that had been missing for days. It was a small wooden animal, its paint chipped from years of use, but it was unmistakably his. "This is Tommy's," Lucy whispered, a chill running down her spine. "He was here." Edith nodded, her face grim. "This confirms it. He was taken to this place. Whoever is behind this must have known he was getting too close to something. The toy must have fallen out of his pocket." Lucy's mind raced. The well was no longer just a place of forgotten secrets. It was a witness to a dark scheme that had been operating right under their noses. Whoever had hidden the documents and the toy here had intended to keep these secrets buried forever. But their investigation was about to take a dangerous turn. As they stood over the well examining the contents of the satchel, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Lucy turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw a familiar figure step into the clearing from behind the trees. It was Agnes Millfield. "Stop right there," Agnes said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "You've gone too far." Lucy's eyes widened as she saw the expression on Agnes's face. A mix of fear and something darker, something desperate. She took a cautious step back, keeping the satchel close to her chest. "What are you doing here, Agnes?" Edith asked, her tone steady but full of suspicion. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Agnes said, her voice low and strained. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I had to protect my family." Lucy's pulse quickened. "Protect your family? From what?" Agnes's eyes darted nervously to the well before she stepped closer, her voice becoming more urgent. "I took Tommy. I kidnapped him." The words struck like a thunderclap, and Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Edith, who remained calm, though her expression was one of quiet understanding. "Why?" Edith asked, her voice soft but penetrating. "Why did you do it?" Agnes took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Tommy found the well. He found the documents. He was getting too close to the truth. My family, my ancestors, have been involved in dark dealings for years. Things no one should ever know." If Tommy had exposed them, she trailed off, her words hanging heavy in the air. The silence between them was thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Finally, Agnes continued, her voice breaking. "I took him because I couldn't let him ruin everything. I couldn't let him destroy everything my family worked for. It wasn't an act of malice, Lucy. It was out of desperation. I never meant to hurt him." Lucy stared at Agnes, trying to process what she had just heard. The woman standing before her had kidnapped a child, but she did so out of fear, out of a need to protect a legacy built on lies and deceit. It wasn't an excuse, but it explained the lengths to which Agnes had gone to cover up the past. "I just wanted it all to end," Agnes whispered, her voice hollow. "But now I've gone too far." Lucy and Edith exchanged a look, their resolve hardening. The truth was finally within reach. but the cost of uncovering it was far greater than they had ever imagined. The air in Rosewood Vale had shifted since Lucy and Edith's discovery by the well. It felt as though the village, long cloaked in secrets, was finally breathing again. But beneath that calm lay a storm of revelations, each one darker and more complex than the last. Agnes Millfield's confession had shattered the silence, but it had also set in motion the events that would bring the village's buried secrets to light. After Agnes's admission, Edith wasted no time in contacting the police. The urgency in her voice when she spoke to them was unmistakable. She knew that Tommy's life was still in danger, even if Agnes had been disarmed by her confession. The police arrived swiftly, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet village they had entered. Lucy stood in the clearing, her mind reeling from everything that had transpired. The weight of the past had been dragged into the present, and though they now had the answers they sought, the implications were far-reaching. It didn't take long for the police to search Agnes's property thoroughly. The cellar, hidden beneath her cottage, was discovered after a tense few hours, and when Tommy was finally found, weak but alive, Lucy felt the heavy knot in her chest begin to loosen. The boy, who had been missing for days, was safely in the hands of the police, his wide, frightened eyes filled with confusion as he clung to the officers who had freed him. "Tommy's safe," Edith said quietly, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Lucy could see the toll the investigation had taken on her grandmother, but Edith's strength had been unwavering throughout. "That's all that matters now." As the police took Agnes away in handcuffs, her face pale and drawn with guilt, Lucy found herself reflecting on what they had uncovered. It had not been an easy path. The village of Rosewood Vale, for all its idyllic charm, had been built on a foundation of lies, fear, and manipulation. Agnes's family, the Cartwrights, and others in the village had been complicit in covering up a tragic death from decades ago, a death that had cast its shadow over everything. The blackmail, the lies, the threats, it had all been to protect a family's reputation and the dark secrets that could have destroyed it. But now, those secrets had been brought into the light. When the police finally left, taking Agnes away for questioning, Lucy and Edith stood together in the quiet of the village square, the sounds of the police cars fading into the distance. "Do you think we've really solved it, Grandmother?" Lucy asked softly, her voice uncertain. "Or is there more?" Edith turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "The mystery of Ashwood Lane may be solved for now, Lucy, but you've learned something important in all of this. Secrets have a way of resurfacing. They never stay buried forever." Lucy nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling in her mind. It had been a difficult journey, but it had brought her closer to her grandmother than she had ever been before. The bond between them, one forged by the pursuit of truth, no matter the cost, was stronger than ever. Together, they had uncovered the dark undercurrents of the village, and in doing so, had brought a measure of peace to the Cartwright family, even if it came at the cost of exposing the village's painful past. As they made their way back to Edith's cottage, the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the cobblestone streets of Rosewood Vale. The village looked peaceful again, as if nothing had ever been amiss. But Lucy knew better. Beneath the tranquility, the secrets of Ashwood Lane would always be a part of its history. And perhaps, as Edith had said, there would be more secrets to uncover, ones that had yet to be revealed. For now, though, they could rest, knowing that justice had been served. Tommy was safe, and the shadows that had haunted Rosewood Vale for so long had finally been brought into the light.